What's good? It's Wug. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Adrien Broner, 34 wins, 4 losses, 1 draw, and 1 no contest, taking on Omar Figueroa Jr., 28 wins, 2 losses, and 1 draw. This is a fight between two otherwise very good fighters, at least they were very good at certain points in the past, who have had multiple long spells of inactivity, and matchmaking wise, it's almost appropriate because both of these guys in the last 6 years have had, bouts of 1+ year, 2+ years outside of the ring. And so from a readiness standpoint, from a are you living the boxing lifestyle standpoint, this is actually pretty appropriate matchmaking, I believe. And they're both coming off of disappointing fights. Adrien Broner was awarded a win against Giovanni Santiago. Omar Figueroa Jr. was stopped by Abel Ramos. Those are their last couple fights, although a lot of people believe that Adrien Broner should have earned a decision loss against Santiago. I thought it was a pretty close fight, and I'm not as convinced that this should have been a loss for Broner as some. I thought that he was landing pretty crisply with the jab, even if he was being outworked, like he's often outworked in a lot of his fights, especially recently. I thought that sometimes he's landing the more crisp punches, even if the opponent is noticeably throwing more. Not to say that Giovanni Santiago wasn't getting to Broner's body frequently, and Broner did look tired, he looked old, he looked ineffective, and he looked less sharp than we're normally used to seeing the, sharp shooting Adrien Broner look. He didn't look good at all, especially in the second half of that fight. And it's interesting, with Adrien Broner, believe it or not, he is actually a 4-division champion. I mean, when you think about his career and you think about who are like the best wins of his career, I would say Antonio DeMarco, Paulie Malignaggi, who else would you put up there? Adrian Granados, John Molina Jr., maybe? Not to mention his early win, we're talking 2011 against Daniel Ponce de Leon. That's probably up there as well. But it's not like he's beaten a laundry list of great fighters or potentially Hall of Fame fighters. Yet he has kind of quietly earned a major belt in 4 different divisions. That's kind of unusual. And, I saw him recently saying that he's a Hall of Famer. I can't agree with that. Even though on paper you would look at somebody and say, okay, 4-division champion, yeah, that should get you in. But when you look at who you beat to earn that title, and did you defend that title successfully, how many times, when you look at the fight-by-fight track record, sometimes that tells a different story. A little like Mikey Garcia, perhaps. But with Adrien Broner, I mean, everybody who's been managing or promoting him, they saw the ability, they saw the potential of stardom, they saw the charisma, they saw a lot of things early, like Golden Boy is who he was with early in his career. And, way back in the first few fights of his career, he was already fighting, down on certain high-profile undercards. Like in 2008, this is his 4th professional fight. He was fighting on the Ricky Hatton versus Malignaggi undercard. His very next fight was on the De La Hoya versus Pacquiao undercard. So, they detected a spark early in his career, and he did, to his credit, win the first 27 fights of his career. So, he was working up the ranks, and then eventually he had a big step-up fight against Daniel Ponce de Leon, beat him via unanimous decision, and this is again in 2011, wins another couple of fights, and then he fights Vicente Rodriguez for the vacant WBO super featherweight, we're talking 130, super featherweight title, and he beats Rodriguez via 3rd round knockout. So that's Adrien Broner's first title win. He defends that belt once successfully, and then in his second title defense against Vicente Escobedo, he wins the fight, but loses the title on the scale. And this is going to be another reoccurring theme in Adrien Broner's career. So he loses his 130-pound belt, goes up to lightweight. First fight at lightweight is against Antonio DeMarco. Very good fighter. His first loss, and for a long time, his only loss, DeMarco's, was against the tragic Edwin Valero, who was, one of the most talented people, pound for pound in the sport for a moment. Died tragically, just lived a very short and tragic life, but he was a pretty sensational talent. And Valero beat DeMarco via 9th round knockout. He was knocking out just about all of his opponents, Valero was. But DeMarco continued to win, and then he fought Adrien Broner, defending his lightweight belt against Broner. And Broner hit this guy with everything but the kitchen sink. This is actually one of Broner's all-around best performances, I believe, in his career. I mean, he was just looking great. He was great on the inside, great on the outside, throwing uppercuts to the body, up top, just going to work. And he just beat the hell out of Antonio DeMarco, stopped him in the 8th round to capture the WBC lightweight belt. So that was Adrien Broner's second title win. And then he actually defended that belt successfully once against Gavin Reese, and then he goes up 2 divisions. And this is what I feel was Adrien Broner's undoing ultimately. Not to mention, I mean, lifestyle outside of the ring, you know, just not taking care of yourself, not having the right people around you, you know, still just, you know, kind of being in the places that, to be fair, are your hometown. But a lot of people who come from rough hometowns who make it successfully, they often advise people, don't keep hanging around the places and around the people, you know, family aside usually, but in the environments that are, you know, super violent and that you would use an opportunity like professional boxing and making a lot of money to remove yourself and your family from, you know. So Adrien Broner's always had like a lot of entourage, you know. More and more in recent years, he started developing more and more legal issues, you know, violent and non-violent, financial issues, just all kinds of things that are the normal trappings and the, you know, all too familiar stories that we get from a lot of the boxers, especially the ones who come from the hood. So if you know anything about Cincinnati, Ohio, that's Adrien Broner's hometown. So, and he hasn't strayed too far from his hometown roots, even after his, you know, major successes in the sport. And I feel like that has done him some disservices as much as it has potentially done him some service, at least from a professional boxing standpoint, and keeping that whole thing on the tracks and at a good upward trajectory. So after winning his lightweight belt, defending it successfully, moves up 2 divisions. Again, I think that this was his undoing, and his first fight there is for the belt at welterweight. So that tells you something about how he was being viewed. His first fight in these divisions, lightweight and 147 welterweight, were title shots. This one is against Paulie Malignaggi, and this was a bit of a grudge match. A lot of unforgettable trash talking back and forth. Some of it pretty cringeworthy. I mean, they just, you know, hit below the belt verbally a lot going into this fight. And this ended up being a very close fight. Paulie was boxing well off his back foot, catching Broner cleanly with jabs and, you know, just kind of slick angles and counter punches. Broner was still a pretty, I would say, a pretty offensive fighter, way more offensive and front foot heavy in these days than he was, you know, just basically anytime after, we'll say, the Sean Porter fight in 2015. Broner has been much less aggressive and active volume-wise after that point. But when he's fighting Paulie Malignaggi, he's still the one trying to administer pain, and Paulie is the one doing the sweet science, back foot boxing, and so forth. So this results in a split decision win for Adrien Broner. This was at the Barclays Center. Pretty big deal at the time. And, you know, even in the post-fight of, again, a very close and competitive win for Adrien Broner, you know, they dap it up and stuff, but then Adrien Broner gets, you know, right back to work on the post-fight interview in the ring where he's talking about, I took Paulie Malignaggi's title and his girl. Just mad disrespectful. I mean, Broner was hilarious in a lot of ways. Obviously, a lot of it was pretty distasteful. I mean, you could pull up highlights of Adrien Broner's, you know, verbal onslaughts, like and anybody could get it. I've seen him lay into Al Bernstein. I've seen him lay into his own promoter, Leonard Ellerby. Like, Broner will let you have it. And again, he was also known for his post-fight interviews. And I remember back in the day when he was still just totally on the upswing, just, you know, winning and winning, earning belts in multiple divisions. You know, after every fight, he would ask his dad, who would always be like, you know, near ringside and stuff. He said, "Hey, Dad, I'm gonna need you to brush my hair. So he was kind of doing the James Brown thing where, you know, James Brown used to have a cape thrown, you know, over his shoulders when he would sing certain songs and drop to his knees in agony and just kind of playing up the drama of it. Adrien Broner would be like, yeah, it was tough. I did what I had to do, but I'm gonna need my dad to come in here and brush my hair. And then his dad comes in and like gives him the hairbrush. Very entertaining stuff. So after winning his third divisional title against Paulie Malignaggi, because Malignaggi was holding the WBA welterweight belt. So after Broner beat Malignaggi, he defends it against Marcos Maidana. I thought this was dangerous as soon as they made this fight. We had seen Maidana fight that very tough fight with Amir Khan, where he, you know, had Khan badly hurt at the end of the fight. And Khan won the fight against Maidana. And then Maidana before that famously was the unknown, coming into a fight where the clear A side was Victor Ortiz. Victor Ortiz dropped him once, a couple times, but then they started trading knockdowns. Maidana basically broke Victor Ortiz, kind of got him to quit after the second or third knockdown. Ortiz gets up, the ref is counting, asks him if he wants to continue. Ortiz basically says no. And that was one of the more interesting, honest, and revealing post-fight interviews after that moment that Victor Ortiz gives after that fight with Marcos Maidana. So that's how Marcos Maidana really made the splash in the sport. So Adrien Broner, again, he's 2 divisions up. And yes, he did beat Paulie Malignaggi. Malignaggi wasn't a big and strong 147. He was never really a power puncher. He was a stylist, a technician. But there's a big difference, right, at 147 between fighting Malignaggi and fighting Marcos Maidana. So Broner goes into that fight. Broner's the favorite in that fight. But I'm trying to tell all the homies that are willing to listen, like, no, Broner's about to probably lose to Maidana. I would not be surprised if Maidana beats Broner. And I was telling people who, again, Broner was like the big name and he had the flashy personality. So people were saying, you know, we're believing that he was going to more or less handle business. But Marcos Maidana dropped him early, dropped him again later in the fight. This was a very grueling fight. And Broner lost his fight. He did battle back valiantly, won some of the rounds in this fight. Like, to me, although Broner lost the fight and he did take a pretty bad beatdown, he showed a lot of heart in this fight. He was wounded leaving. Like, he was kind of being like held by the elbows a little bit and kind of carried or assisted, you know, down the aisle, out of the ring, into the back, you know, the locker rooms and stuff. Adrien Broner had a tough time. I mean, Maidana was throwing those power punches from those odd angles, coming up and kind of corkscrewing down. Broner, like, totally didn't see the punch coming. The first one that dropped him, especially because Maidana was going to the body, so Broner's arms were down here trying to protect that. And Maidana kind of like threw that weird kind of, it's a weird like firework or shooting star trajectory to his punch where it goes up and then it kind of comes down, cracked Broner, dropped him. Broner hopped up and looked a little stiff-legged, had to really fight his butt off to make it out of that round. And really, he had to like fight in a similar way that Timothy Bradley was fighting Ruslan Provodnikov. I wouldn't say it was as brutal as the Bradley fight, but it was a tough fight for Broner. So after that, he goes on a 3-fight win streak, beats Carlos Molina, Emmanuel Taylor, John Molina Jr. Then he fights Sean Porter. Again, this is 147. It's a non-title fight, but man, it's against a title-level fighter. Fights him competitively, but still loses a unanimous decision. He lost the vast majority of the rounds. And Porter actually outworked Broner. That's something that wasn't really happening so much before. Broner used to get a lot busier with his hands. And yes, he was always kind of heavy-footed. He wasn't doing a ton of moving, but he was kind of doing like a step forward, one step at a time, finding, you know, selective times to throw uppercuts. And even when he was getting busy, he was still a bit of a pot shotter where he wasn't putting a ton of combinations together after that Antonio DeMarco fight, but he was still a sharpshooter who was very accurate and was still a lot busier than he's been basically from the Mikey Garcia fight to now. So he fought Sean Porter competitively, actually dropped him in the last round. That was pretty surprising, but Sean Porter won a pretty dang clear decision over Adrien Broner. And then since that, yes, he did win his next 3 fights, and the first of those 3 fights was a title fight. So remember, Broner went 2 divisions up from lightweight to 147. I, again, always thought that that was ill-advised. I thought that he should have stayed a lot longer, to be frank, at lightweight, and if anything, go to 140, not 147. But after that stint at 147, he comes back to 140 to fight Khabib Allahardiev. And this was for the title, a vacant 140-pound WBA belt, and Adrien Broner won that fight via 12-round TKO. So he stopped him in the final round and then defended it against Ashley Theophane, won the fight against Theophane, TKO'd him in the 9th round, but he lost the belt again due to missing weight. And so it's not only these 2 times that Broner's missed weight. He's missed weight a few times, but he loses the title before his fight with Ashley Theophane. So now he's a 4-division champion, twice losing the belt on the scales. And then he wins his next fight against Adrian Granados. Then he fights Mikey Garcia, which I really thought at the time was going to be a 50-50 fight because this was at 140. And I saw Broner as being a lot more viable and elite at 140 than he would ever be at 147. Even though he did capture a title there against Malignaggi, I didn't see him as an elite 147. I saw him as a potential elite at 140. I saw Garcia as being like a 130, 135 guy. Like, this is before Garcia beat Sergey Lipinets to earn a share of the 140 belt. This is even before he beat Robert Easter Jr. to be, you know, a unified 2-belt champ at 135. This is before that. So Adrien Broner fights Mikey Garcia. I think it's a coin toss because Adrien Broner has proven to be, you know, very durable, very good chin, fast hands, pretty strong bodily wise, even if he's not a knockout artist, even though he's still stopping most of his opponents, especially at 140. So I'm thinking, man, Mikey Garcia, Adrien Broner, let's do this. And from like the first, second round on, it looked like Adrien Broner was more or less fighting a survivalist fight, and Mikey Garcia pretty much dominated Adrien Broner. And to me, that was, even though Broner got beaten down by Maidana, dropped twice, I looked at his loss against Mikey Garcia as being a worse loss because he didn't have like a winning spirit in that fight. I was just like, oh man, this one isn't even competitive. I thought that we were going to get a potential fight of the year style fight between Garcia and Broner. And if anything, I looked at this as being a huge step up for Garcia because, again, he wasn't a 140 guy. So him fighting Broner, I'm like, man, we're going to have to see if his punch carries up. We're going to see if his speed and, you know, Mikey Garcia is a small guy. It's like, man, he's going to be fighting Broner at 140. And yeah, he dominated Adrien Broner. And since then, it's pretty much been downhill. His next fight was a very spirited fight against Jesse Vargas. Like, Broner was like really going to work. They were trading body punches like crazy in that fight between Broner and Jesse Vargas. It ended up being a majority draw. And nobody's happy with the draw. And, you know, I thought that one could have gone either way. You could have edged it for Broner. You could even argue that you could have edged it for Jesse Vargas. This was a very tough fight. And, you know, when people talk about like the degradation in somebody's skills or performance, like their abilities, like we've seen in Broner, especially in recent years, also given the gaps of inactivity, but people tend to forget. I mean, they remember the Maidana beatdown, but they're less likely to remember how much of a battle of attrition that Broner versus Jesse Vargas fight was. That was a difficult fight, as was Adrien Broner's fight against John Molina Jr. John Molina Jr. is one of those guys who've had like a fight of the year style fight against Lucas Matisse. Adrien Broner fought a very tough and spirited fight against Jesse Vargas. And then he just, you know, hits the lottery. He gets the Manny Pacquiao fight. So that Vargas fight was in 2018. The Pacquiao fight was in January of 2019. So yeah, Adrien Broner pretty much hit the Manny Pacquiao sweepstakes. Again, he's a very exciting and entertaining personality. This is a big name. And this is right before Manny Pacquiao fights and defeats Keith Thurman. So Pacquiao versus Broner takes place. Pacquiao wins just about every round of that fight, cruises to a unanimous decision. Broner, you know, his defense is still intact. He wasn't opening up, throwing a lot of punches. He was more or less like, holy, how do I, you know, kind of manage this situation? He was basically a survivalist manager in this one, not too dissimilar from how he conducted himself against Mikey Garcia. So by the end of this fight against Pacquiao, I'm thinking like, man, like, are we ever going to get the full juice out of the squeeze from Adrien Broner, or has that ship pretty much sailed? And by the end of this fight, I was thinking, like many, this ship has sailed. I was thinking that after his loss to Mikey Garcia, to be honest. So, you know, that fight with Manny Pacquiao, it wasn't a close fight, but, you know, Broner to this day has never been stopped. So he's super durable, good chin, good defense, even when he's just frustratingly not throwing enough punches. So this fight, again, against Manny Pacquiao was 2019, the beginning of 2019. Broner does a return to the ring for over another 2 years. He cited like financial issues. He's had a ton of legal issues. He's just quote unquote been living his life in a lot of these spells of inactivity. He's made a lot of money. He's lost a lot of money. I hope that he's got enough money to basically live sustainably for the, for the rest of his life. I hope that he's made enough in the sport to not go broke. Like, I think that that's an open question. You'd have to ask him that as well. But his only fight after that 2019 fight against Pacquiao was in February 2021 against the lesser-known Giovanni Santiago. This is supposed to be a let's make Broner look kind of good to get him viable again, get him back in the mix, so hopefully we could get him bigger and better fights again. This is one of those fights. And with Broner, it feels like in recent years, it's just been a pattern of this time is different. This time is different. You're going to get the, the original, the vintage AB. You're going to get, the best of me, basically. And it's one of those things where you want to believe it, but then you've seen the contrary so many times that you can't help but stop believing it, unfortunately. So he fights Santiago. He's a big favorite going into this fight. And, a lot of people feel Santiago outworked him. Well, Santiago did outwork him. Most thought that Santiago should have gotten either a draw or a decision win. But, they took a point away from Santiago for hitting after the bell. It was, not a very entertaining fight, but it was Santiago coming forward. It was Santiago launching a two-fisted attack to the body especially. It was Santiago who looked like he wanted to get into more exchanges, whereas Broner was jab, step away, jab, step away. He was basically trying to keep it as on the outside, as single shot exchange as possible. He did not seem like he wanted to mix it up. He seemed like he was very leery of Santiago's counter punches, even when he would throw a jab. Like sometimes he would throw a jab and hold, or throw a jab, move, or throw a jab and then step into where you smother the other guy's counter punches. It didn't seem like he was confident in throwing 2, 3, or 4 punches at a time. And in the late rounds, it looked like that's what Broner was going to need to get the decision win. But regardless, he was awarded a unanimous decision win against Santiago, but nobody thinks that he looked good in that fight. And then after that fight, he's got another year and a half outside of the ring, and now he's about to fight Omar Figueroa Jr., who was a very good fighter, man. Like, this guy was a former lightweight belt holder. He was a WBC champ after beating, I want to say, Arakawa, and he defended that a couple of times, and then he left the lightweight division. So he was a lightweight up until about 2014, then he goes up to 140, beats Ricky Burns, who was a pretty good fighter himself, via unanimous decision, beats Antonio DeMarco, this same Antonio DeMarco that Adrien Broner had beaten in 2012. So Antonio DeMarco in 2012 and Antonio DeMarco in 2015, very different fighters. By the time Figueroa beaten him, he was a lot more diminished. But at this point, Figueroa is 26-0-1. He's undefeated. Again, former lightweight belt holder, now fighting at 140, and then he goes up to 147 after beating DeMarco because he had a 2-year layoff. After beating DeMarco, he cited, I believe, depression, even a little alcoholism, I think. He just was not all in. He wasn't dialed in career-wise. 2 years of inactivity, comes back and fights Robert the Ghost Guerrero, but the Ghost was only a ghost of his former self by this fight. This is 2017. So Guerrero was a pretty dang good fighter. That's why he got that Floyd Mayweather Jr. opportunity. And Guerrero gets knocked out in the 3rd round against Omar Figueroa Jr. By this point, Guerrero had like no punch absorption. Like any clean shot that was landing seemed like it was either hurting or dropping Guerrero. So Omar Figueroa Jr., gets hit a bit himself, but he's somebody who's going to work you over with, a lot of angles, a lot of pressure, throwing a lot of punches. And he's always coming at you, so he's pretty durable. He wasn't totally reckless. He just had like a high work rate, but it was a measured work rate. So he makes easy work of Robert Guerrero. At this point, everybody, watching that fight says, Robert Guerrero should probably retire. It was that bad. So then after that, he's out of the ring for almost another 2 years. So again, after beating Antonio DeMarco in 2015, almost basically a year and a half out of the ring, comes back, fights one fight against Robert Guerrero. Keep in mind, he's still undefeated. He being Figueroa, still undefeated. Beats Guerrero via third round knockout. He's out of the ring for another year and a half plus. Returns to the ring in February of 2019 to fight John Molina Jr., beats him via unanimous decision, and then he fights a few months later. And this is on the Pacquiao versus Thurman undercard. It's against Yordenis Ugas, and Ugas basically beats the hell out of him for like 12 rounds. He didn't stop him. Omar Figueroa, super durable, even today, has not like, he's been stopped before because he was stopped in his very latest fight against Abel Ramos, stopped in the 6th round because he basically became a punching bag, and it seemed like the work rate of Ramos was just kind of it was just fading Figueroa to where Figueroa, you know, Figueroa came into that fight against Ramos with a weird strategy. He was like changing from orthodox to southpaw every few seconds, it seemed, moving his head like all over the place. It looked a little bit like, which Jim Carrey movie was it? Was it The Mask or Cable Guy, where Jim Carrey's doing like one of these bits? But like the commentators are trying to say like, oh, he's experimenting here, you know, trying to see what works. And so he would like switch here, jab, jab, and hit, switch again, jab, hit, move to the side, move to the side. So it was interesting for a couple rounds, but then you started seeing Abel Ramos more or less crack the code with like straight right hands, catching him cleanly, where you start questioning the effectiveness of that kind of weird stance switching strategy for Figueroa. But before that, he got beaten up badly by Yordenis Ugas over the course of 12 rounds. He was durable enough to sustain the beating, but he really didn't look good in that fight. Like, this was not the same Omar Figueroa I had seen. Granted, he's fighting a very, very good fighter in Yordenis Ugas, so maybe a lot of that was that. But before that, it just seemed like Omar Figueroa Jr. was more of a sweet scientist, more of a pretty good defensive fighter, and somebody who was just able to make you feel his pressure with him landing cleaner punches and more punches round over round. He just wasn't having that same impact against Ugas. He lost just about every round of that fight. And then again, he comes back to the ring, but check it. This is after another year and a half layoff. So now you've got like 3 year and a half plus layoffs. He comes back and he has that fight against Abel Ramos with the stance switching and then getting stopped in the 6th round. Granted, he wasn't dropped in this fight, but that should tell you how bad he started getting beaten down, especially in the 4th, 5th, and then 6th round. So he makes it through the 6th round. The corner, you know, looks at him. He walks back to the corner. He's getting beaten to the body, getting leveled up top. He sits in his stool. Again, hasn't been knocked down once yet, but he just starts spitting a lot of blood. He spits blood like 3 or 4 times, and it's not like a few drops of blood. It's like a few streams of blood where you wonder like, what the hell just happened? So he spits like 3 or 4 of those, and then the corner stops the fight. He's like, yeah, no more, no more. And that is Omar Figueroa's last fight before this upcoming fight against Adrien Broner. So what do I expect between Adrien, the problem Broner, and Omar Figueroa Jr.? Again, I feel like this is appropriate matchmaking given their mutual inactivity, multiple spells of inactivity. But I feel like this is a case of Adrien Broner, who's an inactive fighter, like, I mean, in the ring, not throwing enough punches, versus Omar Figueroa Jr., who might be more of a shot fighter. Adrien Broner might be a shot fighter, but I haven't seen that yet. But to be fair, it seems like he fights a lot of his fights so he doesn't have to get hit, which is a smart strategy. I mean, that you don't want to take more punishment than you have to, but it's also not conducive to winning rounds when you just look like you have more or less a refusal to mix it up and to get involved in a lot of intense exchanges. So is Broner going to be able to move enough to keep this fight being a single shot and move around style fight? I mean, it controversially worked against Giovanni Santiago. Is Omar Figueroa going to be able to absorb Adrien Broner's clean punching and cleanly landed shots, whether it's his jab, which Broner does have a good jab. He does have a good straight right hand lead, although that starts to fade in the later rounds. I think that Omar Figueroa, if you rewatch his stoppage loss against Abel Ramos, yes, he gets stopped, but he's not getting dropped. And Abel Ramos keeps a different type of pressure on you than Adrien Broner will. And I don't see Broner doing the same type of, jab coming forward and trying to come in with power punches, giving you no room to breathe. I don't see Broner doing that like Ramos was for Figueroa. So Figueroa, I'd imagine, is going to keep on coming forward like he always does. I don't know if he's going to try, to continue doing that type of stuff, but he's going to be coming forward, throwing punches high and to the body. Broner's got one of a couple things in terms of how he can handle that. He can either keep on moving laterally, which Broner's a good mover, but not a great mover. He doesn't seem to have great legs, and now he's 34 years old and not 32 years old. Omar Figueroa is 32 years old, but still might be more shot-worn than Adrien Broner. This is just kind of interesting. And let me correct myself. Broner is 33 years old, not yet 34. But I don't think he's going to be able to keep the fight with Figueroa in the middle of the ring. I think that this might end up being a case where we see Broner with his back up against the ropes a lot, which we've seen a lot of that. Even in the past, like Mikey Garcia, that fight was now 5 years ago. Broner spent a lot of time up against the ropes. Same thing with his fight against Adrian Granados, a lot of time up against the ropes. So I think that this, because of Figueroa's style, where he doesn't let you just keep on operating in the middle of the ring, because he keeps on walking up on you, throwing punches. So I think that Broner's going to spend more time up against the ropes. The question is he going to be able to land the nicer, cleaner shots off of the ropes, or is he going to get outworked round over round and beaten up via decision? I don't think Figueroa is going to stop Broner. Broner has never been stopped in his career. Durable chin, and he can fight a smart enough survivalist fight where he could get out walking and standing up rather than getting knocked down, dropped, and stopped and anything like that. Again, even in his darkest moments in the ring against Marcos Maidana, he lost that one via competitive, unanimous decision. But I just don't think he's got the volume to win the rounds, or at least the majority of the rounds. I'm talking like anything from round 5 on, and this is scheduled for 12. When they were going to make this fight, I thought that this might be scheduled for 10 rounds, just given where they are in their careers, and maybe not 12, but damn, they're putting these guys through a 12-rounder. So this might involve a lot more action, and maybe somebody wilts and gets stopped, but I don't see Adrien Broner putting his foot on the gas enough to stop Figueroa. I don't see Figueroa hitting Broner cleanly enough, often enough to stop Broner. But I think that it's going to be Broner who's going to have to be like sort of fighting for his life in this one, fighting for his survival. Basically, I think Broner's going to tire before Figueroa tires, and I think Figueroa is going to be throwing more punches, and I think Figueroa is going to start taking the lead on the scorecard. I had been a little bit back and forth on this one. I thought because Figueroa looks more shot than Adrien Broner, that Broner might be landing the crisper, cleaner punches over the course of 12 rounds and might win the decision. But I'm actually going to go Omar Figueroa Jr. to win this one via pretty close decision. I'm talking maybe like 8 rounds to 4, 7 rounds to 5, maybe even a majority decision. I wouldn't be totally surprised if this one resulted in a draw. But I think I'm gonna shade Omar Figueroa's way by about a round. So we're talking like a majority decision or a 115, 113-ish type of win for Omar Figueroa Jr. And that would be terrible for Adrien Broner at this point of his career. Like, nobody really sees Figueroa as still being a major player in his respective division at 147. And the betting odds reflect that. Adrien Broner is a greater than 2-1 favorite in this fight. It's just, I've seen too many Broner fights now where you're just like saying, throw more punches and win these rounds, and you just don't get it. And even against a fighter who seems as post-prime as Omar Figueroa Jr., he seems like he's throwing punches until he's not. So, if Broner decides to really put his foot on the gas, maybe he could get the stoppage, but I don't think Broner trusts his gas tank enough to really go for it in a way where he could get a stoppage against Figueroa, unless he catches him with like just a beautiful counterpunch, drops him and stops him with one of those kind of one-shot deals. But you hardly ever see that from Broner in recent years, particularly. And Broner's last stoppage win was over Ashley Theophane, and that was was in 2016, 6 years ago. It's been 6 years since Broner's got a stoppage. I don't think he's going to get one here over Figueroa. I actually think Figueroa is going to edge a close, maybe disputed, where like people are crying robbery, people feel like this person won versus that person won. One of those types of wins for Figueroa, but I think he's going to edge it. Like, I do think that Broner's going to be lacking the volume, and there are going to be a few clear rounds for Figueroa, and that he'll be granted enough of the swing rounds for the fight to go in his favor. But yeah, let me know what you think of Adrien Broner versus Omar Figueroa Jr. Who do you see winning this fight, and how? And do you see either of these former champs as being viable in the division going forward? And do you see Adrien Broner do you agree with Adrien Broner that he is a future Hall of Famer? Let me know what you think in the comments, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the Fight Talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.